I woke up to silence, that heavy, awe-filled kind that follows a storm. The rain had stopped sometime before dawn, and all that was left was the drip, drip, drip of water from pine needles and the faint hiss of the cooling embers in our fire pit. My sleeping bag was damp, my boots were worse, and every muscle in my body felt stiff from curling up all night to avoid the leaks in the tent. But when I unzipped that flap and looked out, I forgot all about the misery of the night. The world outside glowed. The fog clung low to the valley below, swirling like steam rising off a pot. And above it, mountains. Dark ridges turned gold as the first light spilled over them, then pink, then blazing orange. The rain had washed the air so clean that every pine, every boulder, every ridge stood in sharp, perfect detail. It was as if the mountains had been reborn overnight, and we were the first to see them. My friend Caleb stirred beside me, groaning like a man twice his age. "We still alive?" he mumbled. I grinned and handed him a cup of coffee from the pot I'd managed to coax to life over the rekindled fire. "Barely," I said, "but you're going to want to look at this." He dragged himself out of the tent, still half asleep, and just stood there barefoot in the wet grass. After a long moment, he whispered, "Man, that's worth every drop of last night." We stood side by side, steam curling from our tin mugs, watching the world wake up. The storm had left the forest smelling like pine and earth and something wild, something ancient. Down in the meadow, deer moved through the mist, their shapes ghostly and quiet. Above us, the sun climbed higher, catching the last raindrops in the branches so they flashed like sparks. I thought about how miserable we'd been just hours earlier. Soaked gear, cold hands, the wind clawing at our tent walls. I'd almost sworn off backpacking entirely, somewhere around 2 a.m. But standing there now, boots sinking into the soft, rain-soaked ground, I felt the simple truth of it settle in my chest. The hard nights, sap and wood smoke. It was hard work, but with sunlight on our backs, even wringing out soggy clothes felt like a small victory. Caleb busied himself trying to fix one of the bent tent poles from the storm. He'd braced it against a log and was muttering to himself like a man negotiating with fate. "You know," he said, "if we'd packed it in last night, we'd have missed all this." He gestured at the sweep of the mountains behind us, their peaks now bright and clear. Makes you think how many good things we walk away from just because the hard part's still fresh in our bones. I nodded, tossing another wet sock onto a branch. "Yeah," I said. "Comfort's easy to chase, but it doesn't give you much to remember." We both laughed, knowing full well that last night neither of us had been philosophical. When the rain was hammering down and the wind made the tent walls collapse onto our faces, all we wanted was for morning to come. We'd cursed the weather, the trail, our planning, everything but ourselves. Now though, with coffee in our bellies and the sun on our faces, the night already felt like a different lifetime. A light breeze carried the mist away from the meadow. The deer were gone, replaced by the quiet chatter of small birds drying their wings in the branches above us. The forest itself seemed to sigh in relief. All the anger of the storm had drained away, leaving behind a silence that wasn't empty, but full. Like the earth was taking a long breath after surviving something fierce. Caleb finally got the tent pole straight enough to stand again. He leaned on it like a staff and looked toward the ridge we'd planned to climb that day. "You think it's still worth going up?" he asked. I looked at the trailhead, still slick with mud and glittering with dew. It wound upward through the trees, vanishing into the bright haze near the top. "We didn't come all this way to turn back now," I said. "Besides, after last night, I think we've earned an easy day." He grinned and nodded, stuffing his patched-up gear into his pack. The sun broke through a gap in the clouds, filtering through the dripping leaves, seemed like a benediction. The storm had scoured everything clean, leaving the world glistening and raw. Our packs were still heavy, but our hearts weren't. Caleb walked ahead, humming tunelessly, the kind of sound that fills the quiet when words don't quite fit. We followed the trail as it wound upward through a forest of spruce and aspen. The trunks gleamed with moisture, and every time the wind stirred, droplets cascaded down like tiny crystals. The climb was steep, but the rhythm of it was almost meditative. Boots sinking into soft earth, poles clicking on slick stone, breath rising in little white clouds that faded into the trees. We didn't talk much, except for the occasional laugh when one of us slipped on the muddy switchbacks. It was the kind of silence that only comes between good friends. Easy, familiar, and unspoken. Halfway up, we reached a clearing where the storm had brought down a huge pine. Its roots were torn from the ground, a tangled mass of earth and stone. Caleb ran a hand over the trunk. "Hard to believe this thing stood for 100 years, he murmured. "One rough night and it's done." "Yeah," I said quietly. "Makes you realize how much strength really means. Maybe not how tall you stand, but how you weather what comes." We paused there for a while, listening to the forest drip and settle. Somewhere above, a hawk called. A long, echoing cry that rolled down the ridge. The air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of pine pitch and wet moss. When we started walking again, it felt less like climbing a mountain and more like moving through a living, breathing world that had just been reborn. By late morning, we reached the overlook. The valley spread out beneath us, vast and shining. The same one we'd camped beside in the storm. From up there, the memory of that miserable night looked small and far away, swallowed by the immensity of the landscape. The rivers below caught the sunlight like ribbons of glass, and the peaks beyond seemed to float on clouds. Caleb sat on a boulder, pulled off his hat, and just stared. "You know," he said after a long moment of evening chill. Neither of us said much more, because sometimes silence tells the story better than words ever could. By late afternoon, we began our descent from the ridge, the sun easing down toward the horizon. The trail back was still slick from the rain, but softer, quieter, like the forest itself had exhaled. Every step was cushioned with pine needles, and the air held that cool mountain sweetness that makes you forget the ache in your legs. Caleb walked behind me, whistling low, and I could hear the faint slosh of water in his canteen, the soft squeak of his pack straps. We moved in rhythm with the woods, the rustle of leaves, the creak of branches in the breeze, the distant chatter of a creek finding its way downhill. Every so often, we'd stop to listen. There's something about hiking after a storm that makes the whole world feel alive again. The birds braver, the air sharper, the ground still pulsing with the memory of thunder. As the trail leveled out near camp, we came upon a section that had turned into a small stream overnight. The mud was ankle deep, and there was no avoiding it. Caleb stepped in first, made a face, and muttered, "Guess nature's not done humbling us yet." His boot made a deep sucking sound as he pulled it free, splattering his pant leg with muck. I couldn't help laughing, right up until I slipped on a slick rock and nearly joined him in the mud. We both burst out laughing then, the kind that echoes through the trees and scares off whatever wildlife's listening. When we reached camp, the place looked transformed. The sunlight filtered through the thinning clouds, casting long golden beams through the steam rising from the wet ground. The meadow that had been soaked and shivering that morning now glowed like something out of a dream. Dew glittering on every blade of grass, the remnants of the storm melting into pure calm. Our fire pit was still damp, but we rebuilt it, careful and slow, feeding it dry twigs from the bundle we'd saved in the tent. Soon, a thin spiral of smoke rose again, curling up into the crisp air. We cooked dinner in silence. Simple stuff, beans and rice warmed over the fire, and ate with that particular kind like tiny stars of their own. "You know," he said, "last night I thought about packing it in, heading home this morning. But now," he shook his head, smiling faintly, "now I feel like I'd have missed something I didn't even know I needed." I didn't answer right away. I just watched the smoke twist and drift, fading into the vast dark above us. Sometimes, words only get in the way of understanding. When the fire burned down to glowing coals, the night wrapped around us like an old blanket. The stars stretched so wide it was hard to tell where the sky ended and the mountains began. The air had that clean, cool edge that comes only after rain, sharp enough to make you draw in deep breaths just for the pleasure of it. Somewhere out in the trees, an owl hooted, and the sound carried far in the stillness. It was one of those moments when the world feels enormous and peaceful all at once. Caleb and I sat quietly, both lost in our own thoughts. The embers pulsed orange and red, a heartbeat in the dark. I thought about how close we'd come to quitting, how miserable the night had been. Wet gear, shivering under a leaking tarp, trying to laugh off the discomfort while secretly counting the hours till dawn. And yet, the sunrise that followed had washed it all away, like the storm had been a toll we had to pay for that kind of beauty. "You know," Caleb said after a long while, "I think that's the lesson every trip teaches, in one way or another." He leaned back on his hands, staring up at the sky. "You can't have mornings like today without nights like that. Nature doesn't hand out the good parts for free." I nodded, tracing patterns in the dirt with a stick. "Yeah, you can read about it, watch it in pictures. But until you earn it, until you've stood out in the cold and seen the world come alive again, you don't really understand what you're part of." The fire cracked softly, sending up a few last sparks. We didn't say much after that. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of meaning, of gratitude, of weariness, of quiet wonder. The wind did, we'd pack up, shoulder our burdens, and move on, carrying with us the quiet truth the mountains had shared, that sometimes the struggle is the price of beauty, and the reward isn't the view itself, but the strength you discover on the way there. The fire finally faded. The forest breathed around us, and I fell asleep to the sound of the wind whispering through the pines. A lullaby for those who'd made peace with the storm.